Welcome everybody to this video on how to remove the motor out of a C3 Corvette. A lot of people have asked me, how do I remove the motor? Well, I'm going to go ahead and show you. You've noticed that this video is really long. I invite you to watch the whole thing. Why? Well, I'm going to show you every single little step that you need to take in order to get a motor out of a C3. I divided the video up into 3 different sections. So the first is going to be what you need to disconnect from the top of the motor. The second is going to be what you need to disconnect from the bottom of the motor. And then third is disconnecting the transmission, and then how to pull it all out at one time. So I hope you guys enjoy this video. Let's go ahead and take a look at the victim today that's going to go for open heart surgery. So this right here is the sad victim. It is a 1979 C3 Corvette that's been taken apart so much it's really not worth putting back together. For example, the doors and the front clip are from a different car than the back. The whole car used to be silver, and I believe it was wrecked, and then they put all this other stuff on, but if you notice, they didn't even bother to bond anything on. It's kind of just sitting there. The interior is totally gone. Absolutely pretty much nothing left. And the last thing really to be taken apart is this motor. So I figured it was a good donor, or at least a good candidate, to show you guys how to remove the motor out of the car. To do this, you're going to need a couple tools. You're going to need a floor jack. I have one over there. You're going to need a engine hoist. Mine is from Harbor Freight. I would recommend getting the 2-ton hoist versus, I believe it's a 1-ton, just because 1, they reach longer, and 2, you don't have to worry about it breaking. It's actually a lot more beefy, the 2-ton hoist. Next, you're going to need a pair of jack stands. Obviously, you're going to need hand tools. I'm not going to list all of those because you need a lot of them. And then there's an engine lift plate, which I like to use on motors like this. So let's go ahead and get started. The first step is going to be removing the hood. Now this is a easy job for 2 people and not really for 1, so I'm gonna see if I can do it. Before you start, you want to go ahead and get the car on jack stands just like this. I have them up pretty high just because it's a lot easier to access all the stuff in the transmission with the car up fairly high. You'll eventually halfway through change this around, but let's go ahead and get started with step 1. The first and most obvious step is going to be removing the hood. I recommend doing this with 2 people, but since I'm alone today, it's only going to be me. I'm using a broomstick in order to hold up the hood while I go ahead and unbutton everything. So the support are 7/16 bolts, and then the hood hinges are 1/2 inch. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to unbolt the hood support, and then from there I'm going to loosen the hood hinge bolts. I'm going to take one side completely out, and then I'm going to loosen up the other side. That way I can lay the hood down and then reach my arm underneath and take out the last bolts by hand. That's really the best way I figured out how to do it by myself. If you're working on a car with nice paint, I recommend putting fender covers on both sides and extra towels, blah blah. Well, guess what? This isn't, so I'm going to skip that step. Alright, moving on to the hood hinges. Come here to the other side. Alright, we have the hood off. Step 1. Alright, next step is going to be removing the radiator. Luckily for me, it's already done. If you look on the passenger side corner, right there where the radiator kind of sticks out, there's a drain. You can get all your coolant out, and then you can remove your radiator hoses. What I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to remove these hoses completely, get them out of the way, so that way it's just a little bit easier to get the engine out. Once you get your radiator and your hoses all out of the way, we're going to start with the top of the engine, and that's going to include this carburetor. Very simple to get off. Basically, it's going to be a bunch of vacuum lines that you need to unplug. There's one for this is a Holley, so it's a little different than if you had your stock quadrijet or anything like that, but you're going to have this is already undone. It's already done for me. You're going to have your accelerator cable. This is your cruise control cable, fuel, Usually there's a couple vacuum lines in the front here if you're doing a quadrijet, and then it just bolts on from there. So fairly easy. The best advice that I have for something like this is go ahead and take pictures of everything, every angle with your smartphone. Everybody has a smartphone. It's easy to forget where stuff went. That's the best way to do it, is with a camera. So take pictures of everything before you take it all apart. It makes putting everything back together much easier. So here's something pretty commonplace when it comes to these old V8s, is you have what's called a spacer in between them. This is what you call a square bore carb. Basically the opening's a square, and this is what you call a spread bore intake. So it's very common to have people that want a square bore carb on a spread bore intake, and they use something like this. You know what, it looks like they put it on backwards, because look, here's this ridge that probably should go over the small hole. I don't know. Either way, not looking too good down in there. We'll see. After you get your carburetor off and you put your engine lift plate in, what you need to do up top is basically disconnect all the little things on the car that need to come apart. So we'll start in this corner. If you want, you can take your alternator off. Makes it just a little bit easier to move around when you get out of the car. You don't have to, but you need to make sure as you disconnect this wire, and this wire. There's 3 wires on these alternators. Next is there's a temp wire. You probably can't see it. It's already disconnected. There's a temperature sending unit right here, and you need to disconnect that wire for that. Coming along around here, there's this vacuum hose for the brake boost. That needs to be either disconnected there or disconnected on the brake booster. You need to make sure that all of these cruise control and accelerator cables are all disconnected. Same goes with any wiring coming from here. Next is the wiring that goes on this distributor cap. That needs, at least the 2 front wires need to come out. This distributor cap you need to loosen up and kind of lay forward, just to give you a little bit more room on the firewall. Coming around the other side, you kind of have the same deal. You need to look for example, you could take that off. You need to look for any other wires that need to be disconnected. This side there's not as many. A lot of it has to do with the AC is already out, and a lot of this has already been kind of torn apart. But we'll get to the fuel pump and everything from there once we get down underneath. One thing I forgot to mention is obviously the fan, you'll need to take that out, and the shroud, you need to take that out. But right here is supposed to be the power steering pump. That needs to be removed before you take the engine out. The easiest way to do that is just disconnect it from the bracket, which are those 2 bolts right there, and then you can remove this belt and the power steering belt, and you can just lay it against the frame. You can even zip tie it to the A-arm right here, and it usually stays out of the way for the most part. So other than that, that's about all you need to disconnect from the top. A couple things that you'll have to remove that I didn't have to are the heater hoses. So this one goes to nothing. It's already been disconnected technically. And then there's one that goes right here that you need to remove. Also, this exhaust valve emissions piece, that needs to come off before the exhaust does. Also, there's a ground right here in the back that usually is there. I usually advise people, if they have headers, to go ahead and leave them in. It's up to you what you want to do, but I usually leave the exhaust manifolds on the motors, and that way I don't have to take spark plugs out and mess with spark plug wires and all that kind of crap. Next is going to be your fuel pump. What I do is right here, this is your return line and this is your main line. I usually like to take these off, and then I'll have a piece of hose the same size with a bolt in it, and that way I can cap those lines off just in case there's any fuel left in the tank. I don't know if there is on this car, but we'll just have to see. But what I like to do is usually take off this fuel pump, because you can't really get to, see your motor mount bolt, you can't really get to that very easy. This one's already loose. That's awesome. You can't get to it very easy, because if they're put in the correct way, the bolt slides out that way right into the fuel pump, so that's going to have to come out. For me, I'm getting lucky even more on this car, so go ahead and do the fuel pump, and then from there you can start working on your motor mounts. There's 2 bolts on each one, and then also your starter has a bunch of wires that go to it that need to be undone as well. Alright, next we're going to take a look at the bottom of the engine. I'll start from the back right here. So that's an old pressure sender. A lot of times it has a wire on it. Make sure that's removed. Next, you're going to go over here to your exhaust. 3 bolts or 3 studs. And then this bracket moves up with nuts to connect to that. Mine's obviously undone, which is awesome. So I'm getting lucky on this car. I'll tell you what, it's usually not this easy. From here, you can see the motor mount bolt on the driver's side. The best way to do that is the nut, I believe, is 11/16. Put a wrench on the end of that, then come with your socket down here and work away getting that bolt out. Here on the driver's side, it's going to be very similar. Here's your starter. You should have 3 wires that go to that. 2 on the big terminal and 1 on the small terminal. I usually like to leave the starters in just because there's no real reason to take them out. Make sure you check for a ground strap on the back bell housing of the transmission. And then also the motor mount. Let me see if I can show you that. There it is. The motor mount's accessible from this part of the car. Again, I'm getting lucky. The exhaust is disconnected from the manifold, so I don't have to fight those. The one thing I will have to fight is probably this fuel pump. So, little by little it's coming out. Moving on to the transmission, the most important thing that you can't forget to unhook are these transmission cooler lines. They actually kind of suck to get out, but it is possible to do. You need to disconnect those because they connect to the radiator up front. And if you don't connect them, you're going to bend them and break them. You're going to obviously need them again. Next, you have your bolts right here for the mount for the transmission, which those need to come out. At the back of your transmission, you have your yoke. So a lot of people forget about this. You need to do it. So there's 2 bolts right there, and then you turn everything over, and there's 2 bolts there in the back. That's why it's important to get your car up on jack stands in order to get those out. Right there should be a transmission cable, but it is already disconnected. Convenient for everybody. And then last but not least, on this side right here, you need to disconnect the shifter, and this is already disconnected on this car. So in about 10 minutes I should be ready to take everything out. After you take the transmission mount bolts out, you're going to have to take these bolts out to go to the drive shaft. Now, what you have to do is go over to the side of the transmission, put it into neutral or a drive gear, and then you're going to have to spin with your hand in order to get to the 2 bolts above it. Obviously you have to have the tires above the ground for that to work, but it's a fairly simple thing. Once you have everything disconnected from the motor, it's time to pull it out. One thing that you're going to have to do is you're going to have to chock the back wheels both directions, because since everything's disconnected, the transmission no longer holds the car in place. Another thing that you're going to notice is look at the distance from the nose all the way to the middle of the engine. This engine hoist isn't going to reach. So it's a special thing in a see-through Corvette. You pull the engine out from the side. Basically what you do is you have the engine hoist come in from the side, lift it up, and kind of rotate it out. The best way to do this is you have to lift up one corner of the car, which is going to be this corner right here, with a jack stand, and then take this wheel off. That way you have room for the legs of the engine hoist to go in and then rotate out. It's really the only way that works if you're using something like that. With the wheel removed, you can see all kinds of room that we have underneath the car for the legs of that cherry picker. I put the jack stand right there. It's a good place for it, and it will work. The only thing I kind of wish I did was scoot the car back just a little bit more. I don't know if that's going to be enough room, but we're going to see. So we are almost at the point where we can lift this out. Here we go. It's ready to come out. As you can see, lots of room for those legs of the cherry picker. I think I'm going to lower down the car 1 notch on that jack stand. The thing you got to worry about is the brake shield, the dust shield for the brake rotor. That's what's going to hit first out of all the stuff under the car. As you notice, the car is it's a little higher on one side than it is the other. Well, I want this as low as I can so the motor can come out and still pass the fender. I'm also going to put the headlights down, just cause. Another tip, remember if you're doing this on a nice car, use fender covers. Also, if you care about the bottom of your oil pan, put a towel over the radiator support and also over all your paint on the front. Remember, I have a 8-foot ceiling with lights, normal garage size, and I can get it out. I don't need anything taller. It's just going to be a really tight squeeze. Alright. Broke it free of the motor mounts. Now you can take some time and look around and make sure you didn't miss anything. Okay, so what I just did is I pretty much dumped the end of the tail shaft of the transmission off the cross member, which then helps it lift out. For some reason there's nothing leaking out of this one yet, but it's a tip that let the transmission drain out of the tail shaft once you get it to this point. There you go, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to do this really quick because it makes me nervous. But both the engine and the transmission are above the car, not hitting the roof, and able to just slide this direction back out. So there you go, they're pulled out. Now what I usually like to do is get a little rolling dolly for the transmission, disconnect it from the engine, and from there put the engine on a stand. Probably what I'll end up doing anyways. So, and there it is, the empty bay, which sadly nothing else will go in. But that's how you take it out of a C3 without messing anything up. Thanks for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed it.